writing in the 9th century from Baghdad in Iraq. Abu Isa al-Warraq surveyed the religious ideas of the many Christians who lived in the regions we know today as the Middle East. Abu Isa was not a Christian. He was an outside observer intent on understanding and critiquing the thought forms and religion of others. He described Christians divided by their convictions about how God could be said to become human in Christ. There were three main groups. He called these the Melkites, the Jacobites, and the Nestorians. Those he called the Melkites were aligned with a view of Christ that was the official view of Rome. He did not have in mind the Rome of the West, in Italy, but rather the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople. Melkites followed a view of Christ, or Christology, as defined by a church council that met in Chalcedon in 451. That council worked a compromise between two warring views, the positions of the schools of Alexandria and Antioch. The council maintained that Christ was both fully divine, of one being with God the Father, and fully human, of one being with humanity, and went on to say that Christ was one person in two natures. That council also condemned the views of Nestorius, former bishop of Constantinople, even as it affirmed aspects of his Antiochene view regarding two natures, a divine and a human nature, natures that remain in Christ, distinct and unconfused, though also unseparated. The Christians Abu Isa called Jacobites were largely West Syrian Christians living in the regions of the former east of the Roman Empire and the former Persian Empire. They rejected Chalcedon's compromise, unhappy with the two-nature Christology traditionally taught in Antioch, preferring the one-nature view that was strong in Alexandria. Their views aligned with the majority of Christians living in Egypt, those called Coptic Christians, as well as the majority of Christians south of Egypt, in Nubia and Axum or Ethiopia. This one-nature view of the incarnation of the Word was also shared by the Christians of Armenia. In other words, the Jacobite or one-nature Christian position was broadly represented through Africa and the Middle East. And this position divided these Christians from those whose views aligned with Chalcedon and the official position of Constantinople. The third group, those Abu Isa called Nestorians, did not think of themselves as abiding by the teaching of Nestorius himself, but instead saw themselves as the traditional Church of the East, one that also held to the long-standing traditions taught in Antioch. These Syriac-speaking Christians living in the Persian Empire, and referred to as East Syrians, saw the views of Antioch as correct, and they adopted them. And so they emphasized a two-nature Christology, but they never signed on to Chalcedon's political and theological compromise, a compromise of the Church under the Roman Emperor. They were, after all, Christians in Persia, and later living under Islamic rule. They showed no desire to be aligned with the politics or theologies of outside territories, and they viewed these other groups' theological moves and political motives with suspicion. Their lineage was as ancient, in their eyes, as both the Melkite Chalcedonians and the Jacobite non-Chalcedonians, and they believed their lineage to be purer and more faithful. To the eyes of Abu Isa, each group that insisted on its truth and orthodoxy was equally wrong. This was because he viewed the very idea of a divine incarnation as flawed, a betrayal of monotheism. But looking through his eyes to see what he saw may help us to recognize the theological diversity of Christianity in the period after the Council of Chalcedon, from the late 5th century into the 9th century of Abu Isa's writing. It is a diversity that comes to light when we see the Christian movement not only as it moved into the West, where it came to be aligned with dominating political power, but also in Africa and in regions of the East, from Anatolia to Syria, Armenia, Iraq, Iran, Central Asia, India, and beyond. In Ethiopia, the Christian Church would come to be aligned with rulers. But in other regions, Christians would have to negotiate their status with regimes committed to preserving the dominance of another religious tradition. Under the Persians, the dominance of Zoroastrian, or the good religion, as its clerical representatives named it. Under Arab rule, the dominance of Islam. Where Christianity's status was that of a minority or non-dominant tradition, it meant that the diversity of non-Chalcedonian religious traditions could be preserved. Without a Christian ruler, emperor, or other centralizing power to enforce a single Christian orthodoxy. Today, when the head of the largest Christian church, the Catholic Church, visits the Middle East, he will encounter Christians of many types. Catholics, yes, but also non-Catholic Christians, descendants of the various traditions Abu Isa noted: the West Syrian one-nature tradition, the East Syrian two-nature tradition, as well as Chalcedonian Christians historically allied with East Roman or Eastern Orthodox churches. Some students, as well as theological scholars of Christianity in the West, are tempted to see the traditions they have directly or indirectly inherited, coming through the definitions of Nicaea, as well as Chalcedon, as the Christian norm, defining an ecumenical Christian orthodoxy. Expanding one's perspective toward a global view helps us to see more than just the stream of creedal thought that dominated in the West, more than just certain views that some of us might have inherited, in forms that have become somewhat familiar to some of us. Perhaps a more global view will help us see more and appreciate a greater diversity of witness. There's always more to encounter in Christian experience.